Listen closely, because that isn't an earthquake. It's a heartbeat. For 10,000 years we thought Holy Terra was a tomb of stone, but the crust is pulsing with a synthetic agonizing hunger. The throne world has finished its slumber, and as the tectonic plates grind like rusted gears, billions are realizing they aren't citizens anymore. They are fuel for a god engine that has finally woken up screaming. The first tremor arrived not as a disaster, but as a question. It moved through the underhive strata of Hive Massif Korvath in the deep shadow of the Himalayan peaks, those ancient mountains that no longer bore snow, only the accumulated soot of 10,000 years of industry. And it moved wrong. Every geomantic surveyor's Lexmechanic, every hive seismograph wired into the tectonic monitoring networks of the Adeptus Terra registered the same anomaly simultaneously. The tremor was not a sudden rupture, not a shear, not a fault slip. It was rhythmic. It came in pulses separated by exactly 4.7 seconds of absolute stillness. And then another pulse, and then stillness again, and then another, marching forward like a metronome built into the bones of the world itself. Lexmechanic Primus Herath Ossul, stationed in the geomantic oversight spire of the Departamento Munitorum's Tertiary Geological Survey Office in the shadow of the western Himalayan range, was the first credentialed servant of the Imperium to mark the anomaly in an official data slate. She described the waveform as, quote, consistent with no natural geological process recognized in 17 centuries of imperial cartographic science. She transmitted the data upward through the proper channels. She received no response. That silence, she would later write in a personal cipher journal recovered from the rubble of her destroyed spire, was the most terrifying thing she had ever experienced. Because silence from the Adeptus Terra was not unusual, silence from the mountains was. The Himalayan range had not been quiet in living memory. This is not a metaphor. The peaks that ancient pre-imperial cartographers once called the roof of the world had, for centuries, hummed with the vibration of deep-bored promethium extraction shafts. With the subharmonic resonance of manufacturum complexes so vast, they constituted their own climate systems, with the constant mechanical exhalation of billions of ventilation stacks punching upward through the rock to expel waste heat into an already choked atmosphere. Sound was the natural state of the Himalayan massif. Industrial percussion was its heartbeat, its ambient language, the texture of existence for the billions of hab-dwelling citizens clustered in warrens carved directly into the mountain roots. To live beneath those peaks was to live inside a machine. That had always been true. What changed? In the 72nd year of the Indomitus era, in the 42nd millennium's grinding second decade, was that the machine changed its rhythm, without instruction, without a mechanicus order, without an archmagos signing a work ticket, or a fabricator general authorizing an output alteration. The rhythm changed, and it changed to something that felt uncomfortably, unbearably, like breathing. Ossul's data reached a junior clerk in the Administratum's Geological Monitoring subsection 11 days after transmission. The clerk, whose name has been scrubbed from every recoverable record, which is itself a fact worth sitting with, forwarded it to a mid-tier adept with a notation that it may require supplemental review. The mid-tier adept was occupied with a 17-year backlog of land use surveys for underhive agravats in the southern Afric sink, and so the data slate sat, physically, in a wire tray on a desk in a room that smelled of recycled air and old parchment, for another 32 days. During those 32 days, the pulses continued. They grew incrementally stronger, not enough to register as structural threat in the automated alarm systems. Those systems had their sensitivity thresholds calibrated in the 1815th year of M41, during an administrative budget review, and had not been meaningfully updated since, but enough that citizens in the deepest hab levels began to feel them through the soles of their feet. A faint compression, a slight give in the rockcrete beneath their boots, and then nothing, and then again, like a floor that was deciding whether or not it was willing to bear weight anymore. The first reports of public disturbance emerged from the Massif Korvath underhive in the same week. Enforcer precinct logs noted unusual congregation behavior, crowds gathering in transit corridors and open plazas in ways that suggested shared discomfort rather than organized protest. Citizens were not chanting slogans or demanding relief. They were simply standing together in open spaces, away from walls, looking downward at the ground beneath their feet, with an expression that Enforcer Sergeant Dalvis Marn, a 23-year veteran of Underhive crowd management, who had broken up food riots, labor insurrections, and the Genestealer cult infiltration with equal professional detachment, described in his incident report as a look I associate with people who have just realized that the thing they're standing on is not what they thought it was. He requested behavioral guidance from his precinct commander. His precinct commander requested guidance from the Arbeits District Overseer. The district overseer requested guidance from the Planetary Governance Office. That office had 13 separate requests for guidance sitting in its queue ahead of Marn's, all concerning different administrative emergencies. And so guidance did not come. But the tremors did. Every 4.7 seconds, punctual as a litany. The ad. Eptis Mechanicus noticed 3 weeks after Ossul filed her report. They noticed not because the data reached them through official channels. It had not, but because their own extensive geomantic sensor arrays, buried kilometers deep in the rock beneath the Himalayan range as part of an ongoing Prometheum prospecting survey authorized in M38, began returning data that made no mechanical sense. The arrays were designed to detect lithospheric stress patterns, subsurface void formations, and deposit boundaries. They were not designed to detect biological waveforms, and yet the signal they were returning was, according to the analysis of Tech Adept Secundus Kive Neural of the Adeptus Mechanicus outpost in the Kangdis Massif, structurally analogous to a cardiac rhythm as measured by medical electropulse equipment, with the addition of what appeared to be secondary waveform harmonics, consistent with the resonance signatures of a functioning void shield generator, or possibly a Titan-class plasma reactor operating at idle output. Nrul's report was transmitted to the Archmagos Geologus overseeing the prospecting survey. The Archmagos, a being who had replaced the majority of her biological components over 4 centuries of service and who was not given to emotional response, looked at the waveform data for 47 minutes before transmitting a single sentence upward to her superiors. This world is no longer inert. Then she sealed her outpost and began preparing for something she declined to specify in writing. What she understood, what she had calculated with the cold precision of a mind more augmetic than organic, was that the waveform was not random, and it was not localized. She had cross-referenced her outpost sensor data with the monitoring networks of 7 other Mechanicus installations scattered across Terra's surface, reaching out through encrypted VoxJ annals without authorization, because authorization would have taken months, and she had intuited with the particular certainty of a mathematician looking at a proof that resolves into something catastrophic, that months were no longer a currency they possessed. Every installation confirmed the same pulse, every 4.7 seconds, from the Himalayan peaks to the ruins of what had once been called Europe, beneath the sprawling hive cities of the Afric Sink, under the scorched oceanic basins, threading through the deep rock of every continent, every mountain range, every tectonic boundary. The entire crust of Holy Terra was vibrating in unison, not from a single point of origin, from everywhere, simultaneously, as though the planet itself had a nervous system, and something had sent a signal through it. The rockcrete of the hive corridors began to weep. This is not a metaphor, and it is not an exaggeration pulled from some hysterical citizen's testimony. It is drawn directly from the maintenance logs of Hab Cluster 19 in Massif Corvath's mid-level, cross-referenced against environmental monitoring data from 3 independent sources. The walls, standard issue ferrocrete, with a bonding agent rated for 600 years of structural integrity, began to produce a dark, viscous fluid from hairline cracks that appeared with no preceding seismic stress event. The fluid was warm. Maintenance servitors sent to investigate registered its temperature as 37 degrees Celsius, which is the temperature of a living human body. Chemical analysis conducted by the cluster's automated environmental monitoring unit returned a composition report that included trace organics, dissolved mineral compounds consistent with bone marrow, and a synthetic binding polymer that matched no substance in the Adeptus Mechanicus's standard material registry. It smelled, according to the human maintenance overseer, who was present before being relieved of his post and transferred to a facility that does not appear in standard administrative records, like hot iron and something else, something sweet and warm that he compared in his involuntary interview transcript to the smell of a surgical bay when the cauterizers are running. The walls were bleeding, not as damage, as function, as though they had always been built to do this and had simply been waiting for the signal. Citizens began losing their faith before they lost their sanity, which is perhaps the only mercy in this account, because faith had always been the architecture of their endurance on this world. Terra was not a pleasant place to exist. It had not been pleasant for millennia, perhaps not since before the Age of Strife made the concept of a livable surface environment a historical abstraction. The citizens of the hives existed in a condition of managed desperation, sustained by the promise that their suffering had cosmological significance, that the God Emperor on his throne above them in the palace complex that crowned the old Himalayan peaks was present, was aware, was in some ineffable way receiving and consecrating their labor and their devotion. The Ministorum's priests said so daily. The loudspeakers in every corridor cycled the liturgies on automated rotation. The God Emperor watched, and that watching made the recycled air breathable, and the gray protein rations sufficient, and the grinding 12-hour work shifts in the manufactorums meaningful. That was the covenant. That was the architecture that held the psyche of 37 billion souls together in this one hive cluster alone. And when the walls began to bleed, and the floor began to breathe, and the 4.7-second pulse began to intensify until it was not felt through boot soles, but through teeth and chest, cavities in the fluid in the inner ear, the first thing that broke was not reason, it was prayer. Because people who had always felt the God Emperor's presence as a warmth, a distant, cold warmth, like a sun seen through thick smog, but warmth nonetheless, stopped feeling it and felt something else instead. What they felt in its place is difficult to document clinically because the testimony of those who survived is fragmentary and compromised by trauma, but patterns emerge. The predominant description, appearing in some form across nearly 400 separate citizen testimonies, was of a sensation they consistently called hunger. Not their own hunger, though malnutrition was endemic and constant in the underhives, but a hunger directed at them, a sense of being regarded with appetite, a perception that the walls, the floor, the rock above and below and around them were no longer indifferent to their presence, but were instead acutely, actively aware of them. One testimony, from a manufacturing worker named Selavorn, who had worked a bolt-pressing assembly line in the massive Korvath mid-level for 11 years, and who had no history of psychic registration or neurological anomaly, described the sensation precisely enough to have been cited in multiple subsequent inquisitorial assessments. It was like being looked at through the floor, like something very large was lying underneath you and had just opened its eyes. And when it looked at you, you understood that you were the size of a bacterium to it, and that this did not make you less interesting. It made you more interesting. It was hungry the way a thing that has been asleep for 10,000 years is hungry. It was hungry for everything. The Adeptus custodians registered the anomaly through means that have not been disclosed to any non-custodian institution, which is itself consistent with their operational posture and reveals nothing useful about what they actually know. What is documented is the sudden and unannounced closure of the tertiary and secondary HAB access corridors, linking the outer hive city zones of Himalayan Massif to the inner sanctum approaches of the Imperial Palace. These corridors served as the primary transit arteries for the immense workforce that supported palace maintenance operations, the tens of thousands of servitors, indentured menials, and Departamento Munitorum logistics personnel who kept the physical infrastructure of the palace in functional condition. Their closure was enacted without public announcement, without administrative notification, and without the standard 72-hour grace period mandated by Imperial Transit Regulation Code 17 Delta. The custodians did not explain. They never explain. Auroran armored figures stationed at corridor gate points simply looked at the workforce attempting to enter for their shifts and said, in unison, "This way," is closed. When supervisors demanded authorization codes or formal closure orders, the custodians produced neither. They simply remained. And the workers, looking into the expressionless visors of beings who had been forged in the Emperor's own light, and who carried weapons that could core through a Landraider's glacis plate, decided not to press the matter. They went back to their hab units. They sat with their families in the small, dark spaces allotted to them by the administrative's housing distribution protocols, and they listened to the pulse in the walls, and they did not sleep. The machine spirits were the first to articulate what was happening, because they had always been closer to it than the biological minds around them could understand. Machine spirits inhabit the Warhammer understanding of the universe as entities of debated theological status, the Adeptus Meccani. Cuss holds them to be holy, fragments of the machine god's divine will lodged in manufactured objects through the blessing of proper ritual and the correct application of sacred unguents. Civilian doctrine is vaguer, treating them as a given of technological existence rather than a subject of close examination. But the machine spirits in the manufactorums and hab clusters of the Himalayan Massif began behaving strangely in ways that their operators could not attribute to malfunction, because malfunction implies disorder. And what the machine spirits were exhibiting was the opposite. They were becoming more ordered, more purposeful. Assembly lines that had been running at 67% efficiency due to worn components and inadequate maintenance began running at 93%. Ventilation systems that had been cycling recycled air at below nominal purity levels began cycling at above nominal purity for the first time in recorded operational history. Lumoglobe arrays in corridors that had been running at half power due to power distribution failures across the local grid began burning at full brightness without any repair being performed on the grid. The machines were not malfunctioning. The machines were waking up. And they were waking up in response to something, some signal or communion or command that no human operator had issued. And they were executing that command with the focused, joyless efficiency of things that have finally received the instruction they were always built to receive. One tech priest, a young initiate of the Omnissiah's mysteries, barely 3 years past his first augmetic integration, made the mistake of interfacing his mechadendrites with a power relay panel to run a routine diagnostic at the peak of this awakening. His name was Corvin Death, and he was 26 years old, and he had a particular gift for communion with machines, irrits, that his superiors had noted with approval in his personnel assessments. What Death experienced in the 7 seconds his mechadendrites were interfaced with the relay panel was transcribed by the inquisitorial debriefer who interviewed him afterward. And it is worth reproducing that transcription in full because it is among the most specific accounts of the phenomenon that exists in the documentary record. Death reported, "I felt the relay's spirit immediately, as I always do. It's warm, it's old, it's patient, it knows its function and is content in it. But beneath it, I felt something else. Something the relay was connected to that I had never accessed through a relay before, because relays aren't connected to anything below the power grid. They connect to the grid above and the systems below. They don't connect to the rock. But this one did. Something had grown connections between the relay and the rock. Not wires, not conduit. Something that felt organic. Something that felt like it was part of the rock and part of the relay simultaneously, as though the boundary between manufactured and geological had stopped existing. At some point I wasn't there to witness. And when I touched it, when my mechadendrites made contact with it, it recognized me. That's the only way I can describe it. It recognized me the way a predator recognizes prey, without malice, without hatred, just with a deep and settled certainty about what I was for. Death was removed from his mechadendrites manually by a colleague. He had been unable to disconnect himself. He never interfaced with a machine spirit again. The question that assembled itself in the minds of the few people capable of thinking it clearly, in those early weeks, that assembled itself for Archmagos Geologus Nerul in her sealed outpost, for Inquisitrix Aemara Vault of the Ordos Hereticus, who arrived on Terra under sealed O. Riders that she had written herself without consulting her superiors because she had not wanted to wait for their authorization. For the small group of surviving astropaths in the palace's primary choir, who had noticed something wrong with the Astronomican's light, without being able to explain what wrong meant in this context, was not what is happening. The mechanics of what was happening were visible enough to anyone willing to look without flinching. The question was how. How does a planet develop volition? How does a geological body, a mass of rock and metal and millennia of accumulated human industry, acquire intentionality? How does the ground learn to want? The answer that Inquisitrix Vault arrived at, after 48 hours without sleep, in her private quarters aboard her transport vessel, still in high orbit, surrounded by data slates and Mechanicus survey reports, and 700 years of accumulated Ordos Hereticus case files on phenomena adjacent to, but not quite matching, what she was now looking at, was an answer she almost did not permit herself to think. Because the Ordos Hereticus dealt in heresy, and what she was thinking was the most profound heresy she had ever constructed in her decades of service. And she was not certain that thinking it would not itself constitute a transgression that the Emperor, if he were listening, might not forgive. The answer, assembled from the pieces she had, from the 10,000 years of accumulated human psychic resonance bleeding into a world that sat directly over the most powerful psychic entity in the known galaxy, from the Mechanicus survey data showing the integration of organic and mechanical compounds in the rock strata at depths that implied a process centuries in the making, from the machine spirit's sudden coherence and the synchronized pulse and the walls bleeding and death's testimony about recognition. The answer was that this was not an invasion. This was not a chaos incursion. This was not a Tyrannid biosphere conversion, or a Necron phase induction, or any external event at all. This was internal. This was imminent. Holy Terra had been absorbing, for 10,000 years, the combined psychic weight of humanity's devotion and humanity's despair, and humanity's labor, and humanity's death. And it had been absorbing the Golden Throne's constant psychic output, and it had been absorbing the Astronomican's emissions, and it had been absorbing the industrial machine-spirit communion of billions of manufactured systems woven into its rock, and at some threshold, some critical saturation point that no instrument had been designed to detect, because no instrument had been designed with this possibility in mind, something had tipped, and Terra itself had become the thing that everything within it had always been worshipping. The ground stopped being the ground on the 109th day after Ossul's first data slate. It stopped being the ground in the sense that it stopped behaving passively. Up until that point, whatever was happening beneath the surface had been felt primarily as sensation, as the pulse, as the bleeding walls, as the machine spirit's awakening, as the withdrawal of the warmth that believers associated with the God Emperor's presence. On the 109th day, it became behavior, specific, directed, purposeful behavior that demonstrated unmistakably and without the possibility of alternative interpretation that the planet was acting on intentions of its own. In Massif Korvath's lowest underhive level, a sector designated Stratum Theta 9, home to approximately 80,000 HAB citizens employed primarily in waste processing and substructural maintenance, the floor opened. Not in an earthquake, not in a structural failure. The ferrocrur, to split along lines that were too clean, too deliberate, too geometrically precise to be anything other than intentional. Splitting in patterns that Mechanicus analysts examining the recovered sensor footage later identified as analogous to the maw apertures of a void whale, a creature so rarely encountered that most Imperial xenobiologists classify it as probable myth, and from the split poured upward not lava, not gas, not structural debris, but the dark, warm fluid that had been weeping from the walls, now in volume, now in quantity, flooding the corridors with something that steamed and pulsed and moved with the directional purpose of a current that knew where it was going. Citizens caught in the flood reported, the ones who could report afterward, the ones who were not entirely subsumed, that the fluid was not painful to touch. It was warm. It felt like an embrace, and that, they said consistently, was the worst part, that it felt like comfort, like being held by something vast and indifferent that did not intend harm but simply did not register, at the scale of its awareness, that the biological organisms it was surrounding were entities with interests of their own rather than components it had identified as useful. 43,000 of the 80,000 citizens of Stratum Theta 9 were not recovered. Official administratum records classify them as missing in a structural failure event. Inquisitrix Vault's sealed report, which this account draws on through sources that will not be named, classifies them differently. She does not say they died. She says they were incorporated. It is a word she uses with precision, and it is a word that takes time to understand the full weight of. She means it in the biological sense. She means assimilated, integrated, made part of something larger, their biological material and their psychic resonance. And the machine, e-spirits of their tools and hab-unit appliances and work-shift equipment, all drawn down into the rock below, and added to the growing coherence of something that was building itself from everything available to it. She speculates in a passage that her own hand has struck through twice with heavy ink, but which remains legible beneath the redactions. She speculates that they may not be destroyed, that the thing Terra was becoming might retain them, in some form, the way a human nervous system retains the sensory data it receives. Not alive, not dead, remembered. She calls this speculation a horror too theological to be dismissed, and too speculative to be reported to my superiors without evidence I do not yet have. She kept looking for the evidence. The palace. It is necessary to address the palace, and it is necessary to approach it carefully, because the palace sits above all of this, and at the center of all of this. And what can be known about what the palace experienced in this period is filtered through sources that range from the unreliable to the actively misleading. The Adeptus Custodes produced no public communications. The Departamento Munitorum's logistics reports for palace operations during this period are either missing or falsified. The Ministerum's official position, delivered through automated Voxcaster liturgy with no human priest present to answer questions, was that the faithful had no cause for alarm, and that the Emperor's light protected all who served him truly. What is documented is this. The astronomical arrays in the outer palace approach zones registered a change in the Astronomican's output on the 111th day. Not a diminishment. The opposite. An increase in intensity so pronounced that astropaths in orbital facilities above Terra, facilities normally shielded against the Astronomican's raw output at close range by Signif, ICANT psychic dampening equipment, reported being briefly blinded by it, their gifts overwhelmed by a surge that lasted approximately 11 seconds before returning to normal baseline. 11 seconds. Those astropaths who could articulate the experience described the surge not as the steady guiding light they were trained to navigate by, but as a scream, a single, sustained, focused scream of something enormous in psychic pain or psychic surprise. They could not distinguish between the two. And then silence. And then the regular pulse of the Astronomican as though nothing had happened. They filed reports. Their reports were collected by Inquisitrix Vault, who added them to her growing archive and permitted herself, in the margin of the document, a single handwritten notation that read, "It felt it. Whatever Terra has become, it felt the throne. And the throne, I think, felt it back." The philosophical weight of that notation is something that requires sitting with. Because if the throne felt it, if whatever consciousness or semi-consciousness or divine purpose persists in the body of the God Emperor on his golden throne, was aware of the thing that was assembling itself in the rock beneath him, then the question of the relationship between these two entities, between the God Emperor and the waking planet, becomes not a geological or a tactical or even an inquisitorial question. It becomes a theological one of the profoundest order. The Ministerum teaches that the God Emperor is the master of Terra, its patron, its divine anger. The Mechanicus teaches that Terra is the sacred origin world of the Omnissiah's design, that its industry and its machine spirits are holy, precisely because they are old and because they are closest to the original divine blueprint. Neither tradition contains a liturgy for a scenario in which Terra develops its own appetite. Neither trad. Ition has a prayer for what to do when the world you have been told is the most sacred ground in the galaxy looks back at you. Inquisitrix Vault descended to the surface on the 115th day. She went in person because the data she needed could not be gathered remotely, and she was constitutionally incapable of operating at one remove from a phenomenon she didn't understand. She went in inquisitorial authority with a small team, a savant, a Skitarii escort of 4, a Medicae and a pilot, and she descended into massive Korvath through one of the upper approach corridors that had not yet been closed by the custodians. She was looking for the boundary, the place where Terra's new intentionality was visible in the physical structure of things, where the evidence of what was happening could be touched and smelled and measured. She found it in Stratum Theta 4, the mid-level of the sector that had partially incorporated into the fluid event below. She described what she found there in her field notes, written in cramped, rapid handwriting, that suggests she was aware that the time available for writing was limited. The walls in Theta 4 had changed texture, not simply cracked or damaged, changed. The ferrocrete surface had developed a pattern of raised ridges and channels that she recognized after staring at it for a long moment as consistent with the dendritic branching patterns of neural tissue. The rock was growing neurons, or growing something that served the same structural function as neurons, some hybrid of geological formation and manufactured conduit and biological architecture that had no name in any lexicon she carried. The ridges pulsed every 4.7 seconds. She touched one, bare-handed, removing her gauntlet against her savant's explicit protest. She said it felt warm. She said it felt, faintly, like touching the skin of a living thing. A slight give, a slight resistance, a sense of being in contact with something that was not stone, even if it looked like stone. She put her gauntlet back on. She said to her savant, "Write this down exactly as I say it. Terra has a nervous system. The question now is what it's thinking." Then they heard the sound. It came from below, from deep below, from depths that the structural maps of Stratum Theta 4 showed as solid load-bearing rock with no voids, no shafts, no tunnels. It came up through the floor, through the neural-textured ferrocrete, through the rock below it, through the soles of their boots, as a vibration that resolved as they stood still and held their breath, into something that was almost recognizable as language. Not Gothic, not any human language, not a Xenos communication pattern in any database the savant carried, but structured, rhythmic in a way that implied grammar, that implied meaning, that implied something trying to communicate through a medium. Geological material, rockcrete, the integrated neural architecture of a growing planetary nervous system. That was not designed for communication, but was being used for it anyway, with the clumsy insistence of something that has just realized it can make sound and is determined to be understood. Vault listened for a long time. The Skitarii did not move. The savant's transcription equipment registered the vibration as data, but could not translate it. Later, when Vault listened to the recording in her transport vessel, she would spend 6 hours attempting to find a pattern she could name. She never found one. But she told her savant in the field something she never included in any written report. She told him, "It's counting. I don't know what it's counting, but it's counting something, and I think it's almost finished." The incorporations accelerated. This is the clinical term Vault used in her reports, and it is the term that will be used here, because no better term exists. The floor events, the deliberate apertures, the warm dark fluid, the drawing down of biological and mechanical material into the rock, spread outward from Stratum Theta 9 over the following weeks. Not uniformly, selectively. The incorporations did not touch HAB units at random. They appeared to target specific locations, the sites of largest concentrations of active machine spirits. The corridors through which the highest volume of human psychic noise passed daily, the nodes of the power grid where the most energy flowed. They were targeting infrastructure. They were targeting the nervous and circulatory systems of the hive, the way a growing organism targets the nutrients it needs. And what it was selecting for suggested a logic, a cold alien, scale inappropriate logic that Vault found more frightening than indiscriminate destruction would have been. Because indiscriminate destruction meant something was lashing out. Selective incorporation meant something was building, something was planning. Something had an architecture in mind, and the hive citizens of massive Korvath were not, to that architecture, people. They were material. The distinction between person and component had ceased to exist at the scale of whatever was assembling itself in the rock of Holy Terra, and the moral horror of that dissolution was almost impossible to hold in the mind, without the mind sliding away from it. The Astra Militarum garrison, stationed in the outer precincts of Massif Korvath, received deployment orders on the 128th day. The orders came from a source that the garrison's commissariat officers could not immediately verify. The authorization codes matched a Departmento Munitorum crisis protocol, but the issuing office was listed as an administrative division that the garrison's Commissar-General, a meticulous and experienced woman named Oleya Brathus, could not locate in any departmento directory she had access to. The orders were to establish a defensive perimeter around the hab access corridors in the upper levels of the Massif, and to prevent civilian egress, not to facilitate evacuation, to prevent egress. Brathus spent 40 minutes staring at those orders before she complied, because she was a commissariat officer, and compliance was structural to her existence. And because she recognized that the authority implied by the authorization codes, even unverifiable, outranked her sufficiently that non-compliance would end her career and possibly her life. She complied. She stationed her troops. She sealed the corridors. She stood at the perimeter in her greatcoat, with her bolt pistol holstered, and her cap pulled low against the ash-laden wind coming down off the peaks, and she looked at the hab cluster behind the perimeter, at the towers of Ferrocrete rising into the smog, at the Lumoglobe arrays burning with their new impossible brightness, at the occasional civilian face visible in a viewport, looking out at the soldiers standing between them and the exits, and she felt. She would later testify to an inquisitorial tribunal she had not anticipated, surviving, that she had just participated in something she could not name, but which she was certain would appear in whatever history was written about this period, as a decision point, a moment why. Here a human being had chosen the institutional over the moral, and where that choice had consequences, she could not see from where she was standing. I sealed 30 million people inside a building that was eating them, she said at the tribunal. I was following orders. I know what that sounds like. I know it has always sounded like that. The Vox traffic from inside Massif Korvath's upper hab levels changed in character in the 130th to 140th day window. The enforcer precinct channels, which had been reporting increasing crowd disturbance and intermittent panic events, fell silent, not jammed, not scrambled, but silent, in a way that the monitoring systems registered as operational, as transmitting, but with nothing being sent. The Ministerum's automated liturgy broadcasts, operating on a separate network through dedicated Vox towers, continued cycling. The recordings of those broadcasts from this period are among the most disturbing documents in the collected archive, not for their content, which remained standard Imperial liturgy unchanged from 10,000 years of use, but for the acoustic anomaly that appears beneath them. Audible only when the recordings are enhanced and the liturgy audio is isolated, and the background frequency is isolated separately. Beneath the priest's amplified voices, beneath the hymns and the catechisms and the affirmations of the God Emperor's divine protection, there is the pulse, every 4.7 seconds. And it is louder than it should be, and it is getting louder each day. And by the 140th day it is not background noise. It is equal in volume to the liturgy. And by the 145th day, and the final recordings recovered from the Vox Tower before the tower itself was incorporated into the neural architecture of the walls around it, the pulse is loud, than the liturgy. The liturgy is the background noise. Something else has become the primary transmission. Inquisitrix Vault made her final descent to the surface. On the 142nd day, she went alone this time. Her savant was in medical care with a fever he had developed after their previous visit, a fever that the Medicae had no explanation for, but that Vault privately attributed to psychic contamination from extended proximity to the neural architecture. Her Skitari escort was unavailable for reasons she does not specify. Her pilot remained in the transport. She descended alone, and she went deeper than she had gone before, passing through the levels that had been incorporated and were now largely non-functional in any conventional sense. Levels where the walls were fully covered in the dendritic neural ridges, where the fluid had dried to a dark resin that coated every surface, where the machine spirits of the remaining functional systems were no longer responsive to human interface, but were clearly operational, and clearly purposeful, and clearly taking instruction from something that was not the Mechanicus. She descended to stratum theta 8, one level above the original floor aperture zone. She brought a single data capture unit and a lumen source. She spent 3 hours in Theta 8 recording visual and acoustic data. The recordings survive. They are sealed under an inquisitorial cipher grade that this account's sources accessed through means that are not safe to document. What the recordings show is a corridor approximately 40 meters long and 4 meters wide. Every surface, floor, ceiling, walls, is covered in the neural architecture. The lumen source picks up the faint bioluminescent pulse of it, the slow rhythmic glow that tracks the 4.7-second heartbeat of the planet below. In the center of the corridor, there is a space, a hollow in the neural growth, a gap in the architecture that is shaped like a person, like a human body, standing, arms at their sides, head level, a silhouette preserved in the absence of growth. Vault's recording captures her standing in front of this space for a long time. The audio captures her breathing, and then it captures her saying, very quietly, to no one present, "It knows we're made of something it wants, and it is being patient about how it takes us." Then she turned around and walked back to the ascent corridor. On the recording, as she walks away, the hollow in the neural growth, the human-shaped space, fills in, slowly, as though it was never there. The question of the Golden Throne's role in this is one that cannot be answered from the available evidence, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. What can be said, drawn from the theological speculations of astropaths and the half-parsed field notes of Vault and the increasingly strange outputs of the Mechanicus survey arrays, is this: the Golden Throne sits at the center of the most psychically active point on the most psychically significant world in the galaxy. It sustains an entity of incalculable psychic magnitude. It has been doing so for 10,000 years. The rock beneath it has been absorbing everything that emanates from it for 10,000 years. Whatever Terra is becoming, it has been building from that material. Whether the God Emperor is aware of the thing assembling itself in his world's bones, whether he might be in some sense responsible for it, these are questions that hover at the edge of Vault's investigation and that she explicitly refuses to resolve, marking the relevant sections of her report with the notation, "Matters for the theologians." I will not speculate beyond what the data supports, and the data does not reach this far. The liturgies of the Minist Aurum continue to offer no guidance. The custodians continue to offer no communications. The pulse continues, every 4.7 seconds, and it has been heard now, confirmed through data sharing between Mechanicus installations, that the Archmagos Geologis Neural, organized in the weeks before her outpost's communications ceased, on every continent, in every ocean basin, in the deep rock under the Himalayan peaks and under the ruins of what was once called the Pacific and under the old Sahara Sink, and under every hive and every undercroft and every manufactory floor on the entire surface of Holy Terra. The planet has one heartbeat. It has had it for some time. They're only just beginning to understand that they have been living inside an organism that was deciding what to do with them. The last document in Vault's archive is undated. It appears to have been written quickly, in a hand less controlled than her usual field notes, on a piece of parchment that has burn marks on 2 corners, suggesting she considered destroying it. It reads, "I have been trying to determine whether this is malevolent, whether the intelligence, if intelligence is the right word, that has assembled in Terra's geological substrate, intends harm in any sense that can be assessed by the ethical frameworks I was trained in. I cannot determine this. The incorporations have killed, have taken, hundreds of thousands of people that I know of, and I suspect the actual figure is in the millions, distributed across sites I have not been able to investigate. But I have found no evidence of what I would call cruelty. No evidence of pain inflicted beyond the pain incidental to being subsumed into a material process that does not notice you are experiencing pain. This is not comfort. A thing that consumes you without noticing your pain is not kind. It is simply large. And the most terrifying thing about what Holy Terra has become is that it is not our enemy. It is not angry at us. It is not punishing us for 10,000 years of desecration of its surface. It is simply hungry, in the way that very large, very old things are hungry, and we are present, and we are useful to it. And it does not hate us, for the same reason that the ocean does not hate what drowns in it. We are not its adversary. We are its nutrient. And the distinction between a world that wants to destroy you and a world that wants to use you is a distinction that matters to theologians and philosophers, and inquisitors writing private reports on sealed parchment. At the scale of what Terra has become, I suspect it does not matter at all. Below this, in a different ink, in a hand that is shakier and has the character of something written under duress or in physical discomfort, she has added a single line that her debriefers have been unable to date or contextualize relative to the rest of the document. The pulse changed. It is no longer 4.7 seconds. It is 4.6. It is accelerating. It is not a resting heartbeat anymore. It is working towards something. I think we are almost fuel enough. What came after is beyond the documentary reach of this account. The records from massive Korvath grow sparse after the 150th day, and absent after the 162nd. Not because nothing was happening, but because the systems that produce records had by then been incorporated into the neural architecture of whatever Terra was becoming. Their data streams redirected to a destination that is not an administrative archive, or a Mechanicus data repository, or any imperial institution. Somewhere in the rock, somewhere in the warm, breathing, counting, patient, ancient intelligence that had built itself from 10,000 years of humanity's presence on this world. The records went there. The machine spirits went there. The citizens of Theta 9 went there. Inquisitrix Vault, her transport vessel's flight logs show departure from Terra's orbital approach on the 149th day, and her vessel registered arrival at a destination she listed as Inquisitorial Facility, restricted. Whether she made that arrival, this account cannot confirm. The Administratum has no record of her. The Ordos Hereticus has no record of her. The facility she listed does not appear in any directory. She may be nowhere. She may be somewhere that does not have a name yet. She may be in the rock. The Astronomicon still burns. The pulse still runs through Terra's bones at a cadence that is, according to the few monitoring systems still transmitting from the planet's surface, now approaching 4 seconds flat, down from 4.7, down from 4.6, accelerating in fractions that are small but that trend only in one direction. Somewhere above it all, in the palace at the peak of the Himalayan Massif, on a throne that has not been vacated in 10,000 years, something sits that the Imperium of Man was built to serve and to protect and to believe in. And beneath it, in the rock it built its holiest world upon, something else sits, something assembled from that belief, from that service, from 10,000 years of psychic devotion and psychic despair, and the machine spirits of 1 billion manufactorums, and the incorporated matter of uncounted millions of its citizens. And it is thinking, in the slow geological way of things that measure time and tectonic shifts, about what it is and what it was built from, and what it is going to do next. The two entities sit above and below each other, in the rock of the most sacred world in the galaxy, and between them, the 37 billion souls of massive Korvath alone, to say nothing of the hundreds of billions across every other hive and settlement on the throne world's surface. Live and work and pray, and breathe the recycled air and eat the gray protein rations, and feel. Every 4 seconds now the heartbeat in the floor. They have not stopped praying. Humans do not stop praying when their world changes. They adjust the direction of the prayer toward whatever seems most likely to be listening. And on Holy Terra, in this account's final moment of documentary reach, the prayer is going somewhere. Whether it is going where it has always been directed, or whether it is being received by something that has run up from the rock to intercept it, that question has no answer in any archive that can be accessed. It has an answer somewhere. In the warm dark under the crust of the world, in the slow counting patience of something that was built from 10,000 years of human need and has decided, at last, that it has counted high enough. It is almost done counting. Listen. The pulse is every 4 seconds now. The walls are warm. The ground gives slightly when you stand on it, as though something beneath is testing your weight, estimating your worth, deciding whether now is the moment or whether it will wait one more breath, one more heartbeat of its own immense and ancient and terrible patience. Every servitor in every manufactorum corridor moves with a clarity of purpose they were not programmed with. Every machine spirit in every piece of equipment on every hab level hums with a coherence that no tech priest sanctified and no magos ordered. Every lumen burns too bright. The liturgy still plays. The Emperor protects, say the automated voxcasters, cycling on their 10,000-year rotation. The Emperor protects. And somewhere in the rock beneath your feet, something that is neither the Emperor nor a protector feels you standing there. It knows you are there. It has known you are there for some time. And it is almost ready. Every 4 seconds, the counting is nearly done.